Hello and welcome to Book Reviews Kill, a podcast about fantasy, sci-fi, and horror novels. I'm Evan.
And I'm Chad.
And you're joining us today for a conversation with Christopher Paolini, author of The Inheritance Cycle, To Sleep in a Sea of Stars, and the upcoming novel Fractal Noise, which releases on May 16th of this year. Christopher, thank you so much for sitting down with us today.
My pleasure. Glad we could work it out.
So we always like to start with this question for our interviews, as we are a podcast primarily centered on books. What are you currently reading, if anything?
Well, not too long ago, I read Blood Meridian by Cormac McCarthy. Still thinking about that one, actually. I'm trying to think about... I'm reading the first Thomas the Unbeliever, Covenants of Thomas. I can't remember the name of the first book. Was it Lord Foul's Bane or something? Yeah. Which is a classic of fantasy, and I should have read that ages ago. I'm also working my way through a collection of North American, Native American myths and legends that I picked up locally. So that's kind of fun. I love reading mythology, and because usually it's like a whole bunch of collection of short stories in essence. So that's been fun. I'm just trying to think. I've been having a blast reading. Are either of you familiar with the short television show Garth Marenghi's Dark Place?
No, I can't say I am.
Okay. So it's done by a lot of the same guys who worked on the IT Crowd, and it is a spoof series and the conceit is that there's an author who's essentially like the bad version of Stephen King, and his name is Garth Marenghi, and he wrote and starred in this television show in the 80s, even though it was made more recently. And it's just an absolutely horrible show, but it's been rediscovered, and it's being aired now with an introduction by him. And it's all surreal and pretentious, and if you're a writer, it's horribly funny because it's all about poking fun at bad writing while being bad writing itself. And the guy who created it, who plays Garth Marenghi, wrote a book as Garth Marenghi. It's his terror tome.
How meta.
It is perhaps the book of the decade for me, because it's nothing but a series of bad puns, specifically about bad writing, starring a writer as the main character. And I'm probably going to send it to my agent, and he's going to tear his hair out reading it. So yeah, that's Garth Marenghi's Terror Tome is what I'm actually thoroughly enjoying at the moment.
Well, thank you for that recommendation.
Yeah, so that's the present day, and I know that everyone wants to hear what we've got going on right now, but I'm going to take us back through time a little bit to the beginning. Is there any specific book that sticks out in your mind that kind of captured your heart and soul and turned your focus to the fantasy genre? Like one specifically that you're like, without this book, I wouldn't be the Paolini we all know and love.
So I tried reading the Narnia series when I was fairly young. My dad had recommended it to me. And I think I was a little too young. I sort of bounced off that. And then I was maybe a year or so later. I mean, so we're talking maybe 10, 11, 12, somewhere in that range. And then a few years later, I read The Hobbit and just fell in love with The Hobbit. It's still my favorite Tolkien novel. And then I went back and read all of the Narnia books. And then I tried reading Lord of the Rings and again, bounced off of them. They were a little too scary, quite honestly. The black writers were too scary for me at that age. But it was really that sort of that combination of C.S. Lewis, Tolkien, and then I just started reading everything I get my hands on. I've talked about this before, but actually it was the one that really, really captured my attention was The Ruby Knight by David Eddings. When I was 9, I want to say. I was in a B. Dalton, which is a bookstore chain that no longer exists, and I was with my Italian grandfather, and I was going around in the store, and I saw this book, which I still have on the shelf here. Well, we're doing a podcast, so I'm not going to pull it off. But I saw this book, and it had a Keith Parkinson painting on the cover of a knight in full armor, minus his helmet, with a spear facing off with a sort of humanoid dragon creature. And I really had no idea what the book was about, but I thought, if it lives up to that cover, this has to be the greatest book that's ever been written. So I begged my grandfather to buy it, and he did, and that was my intro to modern fantasy. And I was like, wow, this is amazing. But then I got to like the last 20, 15 pages, and I was going, wait a minute, how is he going to wrap up the whole story in the next 10, 15 pages? And it was only at that point that I discovered it was the middle book of a trilogy, which sent me running to the library.
That's so funny. I pulled it up while you were talking, and it truly is an epically beautiful cover. And it says book 2, and I was like, I wonder if he knows that he started with the second one.
In some ways, it worked better starting in the middle of the story. I had a similar experience watching the reboot of Battlestar Galactica, because they did a really weird thing with that show where, and I'm forgetting the exact sequence of this, so forgive me, but they had a recap of the previous episode, and then they had their title sequence, but they also had a little bit at the beginning that was like the new episode, then the recap, and then the title. It's kind of weird. And if you're watching it on DVD, and if you chapter skipped, it would take you all past that and start the episode. So I was watching season 1 and was thinking that I was just skipping the recap and the title sequence, and I was missing like the first 5 minutes of every episode. And I was watching this with my family, and we were all going, this is a really interesting storytelling technique they're doing. It's so different, and it feels amazing. And then we figured out what was going on, and we went, oh, crap. And then there was one other book that specifically inspired Aragon, which I'm bringing it up because I had a unique experience with it just day before yesterday. The book was Jeremy Thatcher Dragon Hatcher by Bruce Coville, which is a young adult novel about this boy in the real world who goes to this antique shop and ends up, spoiler alert, buying this stone that actually is a dragon egg, and that hatches a dragon that he raises and has adventures with. And that was I'm not going to even pretend otherwise. That idea of a boy finding a dragon egg was the direct inspiration for Aragon. I've told Bruce this, and he's been lovely about it. But the cool thing is, my wife was actually at our local library 2 days ago, and they were giving away some books for free that, people aren't checking out. And my wife saw that actual copy of the book and brought it home. And I opened it up and I looked, and there's the card at the front where, you can see the checkout history. And only a few people have checked it out since the 90s. And I actually I can see in there the stamp from the exact day I checked it out and brought it home and read back in 1996.
Wow.
So I'm keeping that book. That's going in my library.
Wow, what are the odds? That's so wild.
Sorry. So
an accidental time capsule.
Yeah. So sorry, I'm long answer to a short question. You have to understand, I am used to giving solo presentations, and I've done it for almost 25 years now. So if I start like rambling on when you ask a question, it's because you've triggered answer number 37 from the presentation, or answer number 7.
No. That makes it so much easier for us. We just sit back.
Yeah, and you're on the horn with 2 podcasters who talk for a living. We get it.
Yeah, we are definitely. I'm rambly as hell. I have another question here. Let's get to the elephant in the room. Let's give him some love. Give this elephant some love. What can you tell us about Murtagh? The 5th installment in the world of Alagaësia has already generated so much buzz. It's all I was seeing on Instagram for like an entire day and a half, which is a lot of Instagram for me. So we'd love to hear more about it if you can.
Sure.
We do know that it's not a spin-off or a retelling. It's a full-length 700-page novel, direct continuation of the storylines in the inheritance cycle. But I want to really kind of like dive into this little thing that you said. And you said this, and it was so cryptic, Christopher. And it said, this is a promise that more is coming.
You tease.
Well, before diving into that, I'll just say that the response from fandom and readers in general was exceeded all our hopes, mine and the publishers. I mean, it's a big fan base. I know it's a big fan base, but it's been 12 years since the last big book came out. I had a short story collection, The Fork, the Witch, and the Worm, which came out end of 2018, beginning of 2019. But still, it's been a while since a full-size novel. And of course, the story itself in the inheritance cycle has been complete, so it's not like it needed a follow-on, although there's certainly threads I left that promised follow-ons. But yeah, no, the response was incredible. You mentioned Instagram. I mean, on Twitter, I think I got like 1.5 million impressions
Whew.
within the first chunk of that day with the announcement. Yeah. So yes, Murtag is a promise of more to come. One of the reasons it took me so long to write it is because I went and wrote my sci-fi novels. And one of the reasons the first of those took so long to write is because I spent a couple of years world building what I call the Fractalverse, which is where all my sci-fi and real world stories will take place. And now I am in the position where I have my fantasy world and I have my sci-fi / real world setting. I'm set. I'm good. I mean, there may be some things I'll write that won't fit into either of those two boxes, but for the most part, I plan on just kind of alternating settings from now on. So yeah, there are a lot more stories I want to tell within the world of Aragon. I have talked for a long time about how there was a 5th full-size novel that I had in mind that I wanted to write. Murtag is not that novel. I sat down and was starting work on plotting Book 5. And as I did, I realized there was a lot of groundwork that needed to be put into place for readers to really understand the story of Book 5. How did we get here? What's going on? There's just, there were too many moving pieces. So I took a step back and said, how can I address this? And is there a compelling way to do this? And there was a story in The Fork, the Witch, and the Worm. It was the first story, the Fork story, which involved the character of Murtag, or Murtag, depending how you want to say it. Actually, the Irish way
you say it is the right way.
Well, it is a real name. I mean, the Irish way of saying it is more like Murtagh.
Yeah.
But Murtag or Murtagh is probably a little more. Murtag is the flat Americanized vowel. We'll go with Murtagh from here on out. But that story dealt with that character and provided a perfect jumping point for this new novel. And yeah, it is a direct, inline sequel to the Inheritance Cycle, with the caveat that the Inheritance Cycle is finished. That story is complete. I am not trying to resurrect a zombie here. This is a new story in the world, but it draws directly from the Inheritance Cycle.
So I'm curious, and give whatever information you feel comfortable with here. But when you went to go tackle this 5th installment, I'll call it, is the Murtag story something that you felt needed to be told as like a simultaneous part of the timeline, or had you jumped forward a bit and then thought, well, no, I need to go back and explain some stuff before I'm able to jump forward past when Murtag is set? I was further down the timeline, and totally. I thought I need to go back. So what now is probably going to be Book 6, is probably 10 years after the end of Inheritance. Interesting.
Maybe more like 16 years.
Whoa.
So that's a decent time jump. But there's other things going on in the world I kind of need to deal with.
That makes sense.
Wow.
It's kind of like in Tawny Man when Fitz is much older, which is a
big time jump,
cooler place. Yeah.
Yeah, or even what the 5-year jump George R. R. Martin was going to do. Mm-hmm. But I'm not doing, that what he's doing is more involved, and he was dealing with the exact same characters, which I have a little more freedom than he does.
Oh, that's so exciting.
It really is. We've heard from some other authors that we've had on that there's this idea, and you certainly would qualify for it, that the book grows beyond you, because it's loved and it's personalized by so many people. They have strong emotions with the story. What was your thoughts and emotional state when you sat down to return to Alagaësia? Were you kind of intimidated? Oh boy, I've got a lot, the bar is high,
Yeah. So this year is the 20th anniversary of Random House's edition of Aragon. So I had a deadline and a goal that definitely helped push me to finish this book. So that was motivating. I had also written a bit about Murtag in the short story collection, so I'd already dipped my toe into his mind a little bit, into the character. That was helpful. Even back with Aragon, there were a couple of chapters from Murtag's point of view in the self-published edition that got cut in for the Random House edition. So this wasn't completely from scratch getting back into Murtag, but it still took a lot of work, because different character than Aragon, his needs as a character were different, and the voice he needed was different. Also, I'm not the same person I was at 15, so
Right.
and I did feel also that there's an expectation from the fans, and you see this with other series, but especially with this one, perhaps, that, you know, if you were 14 when you read Aragon, I mean, you're going to be 30, 34 now, 35. The characters have grown up, the readers have grown up. I think there's an expectation that the book itself should be a little more sophisticated, perhaps. Now, that doesn't mean it's not going to be a rip-roaring adventure. It doesn't mean that I'm throwing in profanity and sex and violence everywhere. I'm not. I just felt like it needed to be more mature. Still enjoyable by a younger reader, but a little more sophisticated. Let's put it that way.
I noticed that in even the change from Aragon into Eldest, without spoiling much. I mean, I felt like Aragon's temperament, when it came to another character that he really liked, grew up a little bit and saw more aspects of what that relationship could be, which I thought was a really great way to tackle that. And it kind of like showcased, no, there's movement going on here, there's growth going on here, people are getting older. And hearing that you're going to continue on with that into, shall we say, middle age, which I don't like that term. It's not my term, but
I mean, I'm gonna be touring during my 40th birthday for this book.
That's awesome.
So,
Wow.
I mean, that's halfway to 80. I think middle age is definitely the appropriate term here.
Whew.
Hey, 40 is the new 25, so you're in your prime.
No, it is not. I'm sorry, people. You know, actually, I'm going to rant for 1 second here.
Go for it.
Do it.
Yeah,
I
that's
think
why we're here.
the attitude that, especially for men, sometimes, you know, that you can just mess around in your 20s and don't focus, and you still have time in your 30s to build. And it's true, you know, it's never too late, but. I think that really does a disservice to your own life and your own energies and your own focus, because if you can focus and build and take things seriously, even from an early age, you get such a leg up. And, you know, life is short, even though it is the longest thing we ever do. It is difficult, and there are no guarantees of anything. So, no, I mean, focus and work hard as soon as you can.
Love that.
I agree with that a lot, actually. And I mean, Alexander the Great, right, conquered the known universe by the time he was 27. You know, I'm 33. I'm like, man, I'm really falling behind that bar, you know?
I mean, all I know is that when I sneeze, my back hurts. So
Yeah.
like, that's annoying. That didn't used to happen.
Yeah, that's actually why I've been really pushing hard with the exercise recently. It's like, you know, it's like, I think I'd say about it's like 34, 35, you really realize if you don't move, you lose it. Whatever it is, flexibility, stamina, strength, whatever. If you don't use it, you lose it. And yeah.
Yeah, I used to exercise to try to be hot, and now I'm just doing it so that my knees don't hurt.
Right.
So I can breathe when I go
I can
upstairs.
sit crisscross applesauce for 5 minutes without going into crazy pain.
There's a great saying from Dick Van Dyke about that. I can't remember the whole thing, but he broke out his life with exercise, was saying similarly, it's like, you know, I exercised to look good when I was young, and this, that, at this age, and this, and now I just do it so I stay alive.
That's the goal.
So I don't know if you are aware, but Evan and I have been working our way through your the Inheritance Cycle series. Just finished the 4th one last night, in fact. And
Oh, wow.
it was so nice to reread it, because I read it when they came out when I was 15, 16, you know, way back in the day.
Yeah.
All of the books I read in Barnes and Noble, because my parents lived kind of outside of town. So I just would go in there and pull it off the shelf and just read it away. And I'm wondering, as the story progressed, obviously you grew as a writer, the story grew, it got more complex, both in plot and character development. What was your process of expanding Alagaësia like? Did you have to plot it all out and make an outline, or were you just like pony forward into the breach, my friends?
I had a pretty good outline for the entire story of the series, and I can prove that. But before I started the first book, and I can prove that because if you go to Aragon and you go to the scene after Aragon drags his uncle Garrow back to Carvajal, and then Aragon has sort of a feverish night of bad dreams. The bad dream, or the dream that he has that night, is actually the very last scene of the 4th book.
Oh, wow.
And
Really?
yeah.
Oh, wait. Yeah.
Yeah, you can go look that up.
Wow.
You
Now,
buried it in there.
some of the specifics changed. I won't lie. Originally, Aragon and Arya were going to leave together. So there were a few things like that certainly changed as I gained a greater understanding of the characters and just grew up on my own. But I had a very good outline for the series before I started it, and then I outlined each book in pretty substantial detail before starting it. And that's because I cannot plot and write at the same time. I suck at that. I need a good roadmap, and then I can concentrate on performing it, aka writing it, as beautifully as possible. But the thing is, as far as like growing Alagaësia, building the world, a lot of that happened as I was writing. And I found that, at least for me, the more I write in a world and the more I write with with characters, the more stories suggest themselves, the more world building details suggest themselves. So not to frustrate my readers too much, but they're going to read Murtagh and immediately go, okay, but what about this, that we need books about all those things. And if I write books about all those things, and I may, they're going to have 10 more questions and things that they're excited and interested in, because that's just the way the world works. That's the way life works. You never reach the end.
It's like a Hydra. Every time you answer a question, it brings up more questions.
Which I think is exactly what like George R. R. Martin has battled, and he's talked about that. That's the Gardner approach to writing, where the gardening approach, where you have so many storylines and characters that are growing, and each one can foster 5 more or however many.
Well, it's interesting the way that he did it too, because it seems like he almost took a back seat and was watching what these characters were going to do next based on the context of what they'd done before.
Yeah.
And that's a really great way to have this organic story happening. But at the same time, he doesn't have as much of a hold on it now. Like he doesn't have it.
It also depends on how your brain works, because you need the characters to feel real to you, the author. But you also, at least for me, I'm trying to achieve a certain effect and tell a certain story. But if you can achieve that sense of reality, it almost doesn't matter what the story is sometimes. I mean, that's Stephen King takes that approach also. And then, of course, a lot of people say, his endings tend to be sometimes less strong than the rest of the book. But that's sometimes a result of that approach. But the upside is his characters are often incredibly vivid, and the writing itself is very, gripping and conversational. And there's trade-offs for everything. But if you have to find a way as a writer that lets you feel the reality of the characters in the world, however that works for you.
You wrote Aragon book 1 in the Inheritance cycle as a teenager and have since very much honed your craft. Is there anything about Aragon, that first book, that you wish that you could change, or any scenes or developments that you would add or subtract to that particular book?
Absolutely. We didn't mention this actually, but along with Murtagh on November 7th, we are also releasing the 20th anniversary illustrated edition of Aragon, which has over 50 paintings and drawings, full color, full page spreads. It's actually a wider format book, so the text is in 2 columns. It's just an absolutely gorgeous package. Folks can actually look it up online and see some of the art inside it right now.
Any done by yourself? I know you're somewhat of an artist.
No, not this. Well, actually, no. Even the map got redone. So Murtagh has about 7 or 8 new pieces of art by me, some maps and some other stuff. But the illustrated edition of Aragon is entirely done by Siddharth, who's a D&D and magic and fantasy artist. Really, really gorgeous stuff. But my point was, because the text got reformatted, I actually had to look at the text of Aragon in a way I haven't in a while. And there were even some copy editing questions on it. And as I was going through it, there were a few paragraphs I looked at and said, hey, that's pretty good. That's not too bad. But there was a lot of it I looked at and I was like, boy, if I were doing this now, I think I could give it a lot more depth. I think I could just bring a lot more to it on a line-by-line basis, scene-by-scene basis, probably even add some more scenes in. But there's part of me that wants to go back and do a author's preferred edition. I mean, again, Lucas. Stephen King did that with the Dark Tower series. Mm-hmm. He redid, I think, the first 2 books, certainly the first book.
First book for sure.
But then, that's time and energy that I could spend writing a completely new story, and it's not like Aragon has been unsuccessful. So, cost benefit analysis there.
Yeah, and I wonder if that's like a creative black hole to fall into.
That's kind of my sentiment, and also there's a good chance I'm going to be reworking all this material anyway for the Disney television show. So since I'm going to be a writer on that also, so I don't really want to have to do it any more than I have to.
Chad, I think you were going to ask about that.
I just learned about that because I was just digging into stuff and I saw it come up and I was blown away that it was going to happen. Are you at a stage of the creation that you can tell us any sort of teasery or any sort of when we might expect some more information?
No, we're looking for a key person in the process, and until we have that person, we really have nothing to talk about.
Sure.
And Hollywood it's difficult in Hollywood because a lot of people that you might want or who might be interested in the project are usually under contract for other projects that are already going on, or they're under a development deal somewhere else, and it really needs to be the right person who's going to help bring this to life. So that's what we're looking for right now. That's who we're looking for right now. And it's not enough just for someone to be interested in the project. They also have to have I want to say the right taste and flavor to their own work, so that whatever we produce in collaboration is going to be, something that people feel is Aragon and does it justice. Because if we get something that is like the film, for example, that's it for this franchise as far as film or television adaptations go. I mean, we're going to have to wait probably 30 or 40 years to see another adaptation if it were to ever get another one, right? So this really has to go well, or that's it.
Yeah,
I like the movie.
Evan and I get into fights about this all the time.
I said it on TikTok and everyone jumped down my throat. I was like, we've got Jeremy Irons is in this movie.
I am going to say something very controversial in the Aragon fandom, but I'm the author, so I guess I can say it. The film isn't really that bad of a film, okay? As a film, it's not a great one, but it's not horrible. We've all seen horrible films. It's not that, but it's not a great adaptation. Yeah. And that's the problem. And especially, and I think it really suffers in comparison. That's you start saying, well, where's this? Where's that? And it doesn't feel like it needs to feel. And that's where it falls down. And the crazy thing is they actually had a huge budget, but it was a mess behind the scenes. And so if you were to look at the film, and if I were to ask you to guess the budget, you would guess far below what they actually spent on it.
Interesting.
Wow. It was definitely in that age where the CGI that would be required was very expensive, that sort of thing. Well, anyway, we're all very excited to see Aragon come to the screen, and I think that it deserves at least in my mind, and I know I could probably speak for millions of others, that it deserves it deserves to be taken the time to do it right. So I think that that's the right approach, and I think that we're all really stoked that you're super involved with the creation process of it.
I'm trying.
Now, to take us back to Aragon a little bit, I was just kind of debating with Evan the other day on the podcast as to how one goes about creating another language. Like, do you just kind of shoot from the cuff? Like, that sounds Elvish, skull block, or like, and how do you know that you've never used that word before and keep yourself consistent?
Well, look, I mean, I'm not a linguist. I was a teenager in Montana. The internet was barely a thing when I was starting. There's a couple answers to this. I mean, if you want to do it properly, go become a professor of linguistics, just like Tolkien, and do it right. I'm sure both of you have heard the thing about, that it's not quite true, but that Tolkien essentially created Middle Earth in order to support his languages. Well, the truth behind that is that when you really start thinking about words, every word has a history, and that history is tied into the history of the world, of the nations and the peoples involved in the creation of that word. And in order to really understand that word, you have to know that history. So that's ultimately what led Tolkien to do what he did. It's an incredibly involved process. An example of this is, I am going to get this entirely wrong, but I'm gonna. It'll prove my point roughly. There was an admiral in the British Navy who wore a coat made of a certain fabric, woolen fabric that was like grog. I can't even remember what the word is, but part of it was grog. Okay. And as part of his policy with his sailors is he made sure that the sailors got a daily ration of, I believe, watered rum. And because they liked that, they started calling it their daily ration of grog. After old grog, because if he wore that coat, their admiral. And of course, what happens if you drink too much of that watered rum? You get groggy.
Wow.
Whoa.
Okay. I really should look up the specifics of this so I can really tell this story properly. But that's just one word, and you can do that for basically every word. So to really answer your question, what happened in my case is I needed a word for fire because that's the first magical word that's used in the books, outside of the very first chapter, which I didn't have originally. So I needed a word for fire, magical word for fire, and I pulled out a dictionary of word origins, which I'm looking at on my desk right now, and I was flipping through it, and I found an Old Norse word, brissinger, that is related. There's some mythological meaning there, but it can mean fire, and I liked it, so I used it. And then I started researching Old Norse and used a lot of Nordic and Germanic words as the roots for my magical language. I was a little more consistent and structured with my approach to my other languages, like my Dwarvish and some of my other ones. The thing is you can create a perfectly consistent, well-structured and interesting fantasy language inside of an afternoon if you need to, or a day or two. Basically, you just need to select what consonants you're going to have, what vowels, create some rules for how they combine, and then create some grammar for your language. And all of that can be fairly arbitrary if you're not too concerned with authenticity. And this is without thinking about the history of your world. You're just creating this system. And then you just start creating some words based off the patterns and structures that you've already established, the rules. And there you go. You're good to go. And there are lots of websites for creating artificial languages. And again, though, if you can go as deep as you want with that and spend years on it if you want, and get as complicated as you want. But doing it roughly and basically like that, you can knock it off pretty fast. And then you definitely have to create files and keep track of all the words you invent, alphabetize them, translate them, keep all your rules written down. That's what I ended up having to do also.
That's smart. I'm such a shoot from the hip sort of person that I feel like I would just be like, this word sounds cool. And then 2 books
that
later,
was basically
I'd be in a world of pain.
No, that's basically how I started. And I didn't really start getting more structured with it until I got into Eldest. I was writing Eldest, and Random House was releasing a deluxe/special edition of Aragon. So one of the ideas we had for it was to include some more language material in the back. So I started codifying some of the rules for the ancient language and writing it down. And as I was going through that, I realized that I screwed up when Aragon blesses the baby in Aragon, in the first book, when he blesses the child who becomes Elva. And Aragon didn't mess up the blessing. I messed up the blessing. I used the wrong word.
That's a pretty key scene, too.
That's so important. Yeah, that changes a lot of stuff. Wow.
Exactly. So I had a choice. I could either just fix the word in reprints. I mean, it would have been a simple little fix. But I was, as I said, stories suggest more stories. Ideas suggest more ideas. So I started asking myself, well, what if he actually did screw up? What would the implications be? And that led to that whole storyline with Elva.
Wow. Have you ever told that story to anyone before? Or were we the first people to be privy to that? That's a cool Easter egg right there.
I think I've mentioned it before, but my point
I want to be the
first,
Christopher.
like you, I started shooting from the hip with a lot of stuff, and I have learned through painful experience that it is worth putting the groundwork in beforehand. If you think of a book like a magic trick, you want it to appear effortless to the audience, but to get to that point, you have to be willing to do more practice and more, go through more discomfort than anyone would think you actually have to. It's like, well, of course he didn't make the ball disappear by that method. No one would be crazy enough to do it that way. And of course, yes, the magician is crazy enough to do it that way. That's kind of what writing's like. And the more I do it, the more I've really come to appreciate the importance of preparatory work.
Speaking of discomfort, what was the and feel free to include some minor spoilers here. What was the most difficult or emotionally taxing scene in the inheritance cycle for you to write?
Oh, emotionally taxing.
Like just crying, at your keyboard.
Weeping into your
Just
keyboard.
weeping.
Well, I mean, so
Wife's checking on you.
this is spoilers for a series that's been finished for 12 years. So apologies, everyone.
It's on you, listener.
In the first book, when the character Brahm dies, that was rough to write for me. Overall, I'd say the character of Arya was very difficult for me to write over the course of the series, just because I am many things, but 100-year-old elven princess I am not. Especially
Had us fooled, Christopher.
Especially as a kid. And then writing the last chapter of the series was incredibly emotional. I kind of expected it to be, but it hit me harder than I actually thought it would. Just because it had been such a big part of my life for so long.
You're saying goodbye to these people.
Yeah. And it's hard. I mean, I think there are some authors who don't end their series because it's just too painful, and you get so comfortable with the characters in the world. It's like, I can just keep writing here forever. And sometimes they do, and sometimes they produce wonderful books. But I'm a big believer that a good story needs a proper ending. Whether or not you agree with how I ended the story, at least it's got an ending. And that's also why I like To Sleep in a Sea of Stars is basically a series in a single book. It has an ending. Fractal Noise has an ending. Murtagh has an actual ending for the story that's being told in that book. And that's very important to me. And especially if you look back at a lot of classic sci-fi and fantasy, and some of those books are really short, actually. And you go, why are we needing absolutely giant books these days to tell a story that someone was able to tell in 200 pages in the past?
Like all the little Conan books, those things were slivers.
Yeah, or Wizard of Earthsea, a lot of Bradbury's stuff. You
talking about how a author just can't let a character go, and immediately popped into my brain, which is Drizzt Stewardin from R.A. Salvatore. I don't know if you've read any of his work, which I really love, but
I have.
It just goes on.
Hey, as long as it's good, it's good.
Right, yeah, it is good. You've spent a lot of your time lately on, well, I mean, now we know you're spending your time writing Murtagh, but you spent a lot of your time on science fiction lately with To Sleep in a Sea of Stars and the upcoming book, Fractal Noise, which both are in the Fractalverse. How did you feel about making that switch to a different genre altogether after your success with high fantasy? I mean, you could have just kept doing high fantasy. Obviously, it worked, so now you're moving on to science fiction. And, obviously there is like this kind of argument about whether or not science fiction and fantasy are really all that different or whatever. But I feel like there are some differences. Like, how did you approach that? What was that like?
Well, I mean, I wanted to change a pace. I wanted to prove I could write something different. I wanted to write something more adult. I grew up reading as much sci-fi as fantasy, and I like them for different reasons, but I like them both equally. In some ways, and I'm generalizing ridiculously broadly here. I know there are many exceptions, but in many ways, fantasy is a nostalgic genre. It's a backwards-looking genre. And in many ways, science fiction is a forward-looking genre. And I really enjoy thinking about the size of the universe and what might be out there and humanity's hopeful future out there, and also just the potential possibilities out there. So all of that stuff was fun to write about. Also, after spending, however long it was, over a decade on the inheritance cycle, I really wanted to use my everyday vocabulary. I wanted to be able to use my, English as I speak it, instead of having to, write something that's more constrained or different with fantasy. And that was a challenge at first. I actually had to really work at purging a lot of the expressions I used in the inheritance cycle. I'd say the biggest thing that I ran into as far as differences with sci-fi fantasy is that fantasy, you break the laws of physics and someone asks, how did you do that? And you say, a wizard did it. Magic. And in science fiction, you say, well, you reversed the flux capacitor and inverted the tachyon beam and da 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 da. You can do that with magic also, but it's more prevalent in science fiction. Also, if you're trying to be semi-realistic, machines really have hard limitations that you don't have with living creatures. So if you have your characters traveling from point A to point B in a fantasy world, and they're on horses, and they absolutely have to get there faster, you know, there's some wiggle room. You can push the horses faster. Okay, the horse is keeled over. Well, now you're running on foot. You can really push yourself really, really hard because it's the end of the world, and you can pull off something extraordinary. With, rockets, spaceships, there are very hard limits on what you can do. You know, the frame of the ship is only rated for so much force. You only have so much propellant, and you only have so much delta V, and that's just what it is. So that definitely imposed some real storytelling limits on what was possible. But I liked that because it ended up suggesting other possibilities. It was like, okay, it's going to take, 6 weeks to travel from point A to point B. It is what it is. All right, what do I do now?
Yeah, it kind of introduces some conflict.
Yeah, and you need those sorts of restrictions, because otherwise you get situations where, okay, FTL is possible, so what's stopping someone from strapping an FTL engine to a mile-wide asteroid and dropping it right on top of someone's planet, right? If it's traveling faster than light, how do you detect it? How do you stop it? How do you, all that stuff is fun to think about. Which, we were talking about this before our podcast started, where you were talking about The Expanse, reading The Expanse.
Yeah.
Those authors, the authors of The Expanse, and I actually used the same resource, which is this amazing website called Atomic Rockets, atomicrockets.com. And Winchell Chung, the guy who runs it, created it specifically as a resource for sci-fi authors to create more realistic and interesting science fiction. And it has all the resources you could want on everything from potential engines, both, speculative and realistic, energy sources, food sources, weapons, how all of this might interact. He doesn't touch on social stuff. That's for the authors to deal with. But from a technical standpoint, it's a fantastic resource.
So for our listeners and for readers that haven't read To Sleep in a Sea of Stars, when Fractal Noise comes out, would you encourage people to read To Sleep in a Sea of Stars before they read Fractal Noise, or can they read either one?
They can read either one. Fractal Noise is a prequel. It doesn't share any of the same characters, so they're really not connected, although they're dealing with some of the same things. And if you have read To Sleep in a Sea of Stars, you will potentially get more out of Fractal Noise, but it is not necessary in the slightest. I actually wrote Fractal Noise first. I wrote it back in 2013, but I wasn't really happy with the first draft, and it was about half the size it is now. It was a very dark first draft. So I decided that even though I could revise it and get it to the standard I wanted, that it would not be a good introduction to the Fractalverse. So I shelved it, finished To Sleep, finished Forkwitch Worm, and then came back and revised Fractal Noise before writing Murtag, and I'm much, much, much happier with where it ended up.
Did you have Fractal Noise in mind while you were writing To Sleep in a Sea of Stars, or was it kind of like this shelved thing that happened to be connected, but you were really working on To Sleep in a Sea of Stars?
I was really just working on To Sleep in a Sea of Stars. I mean, I would think about Fractal Noise every once in a while, in the sense that I knew it wasn't successful, and so I was sitting there. I have a couple of stories like that I like the premise, but I'm not quite sure how to make it work as a story, and so I usually, whenever I'm daydreaming or in the shower, those are the things I'll be thinking about. It's like, okay, how do I solve this problem? And when I solve it, then I go write it.
So with the revision process, I mean, like, how much of these connections that you're making where your aha moments where something it does work, even though it was giving you an issue, how much of that is sorted out in the outlining process, and then how much of that is sorted out in the revising process for you? It might be different per book, obviously.
Yeah, it depends on the book.
Totally.
And everything's been different since the Inheritance Cycle. The Inheritance Cycle was a classic coming-of-age story, so there were some very well-worn, age-proven tropes that I was able to rely on, especially in the first book, that has served as a safety net as a new writer to sort of get my feet under me. And that really hasn't been true of these later books, especially Fractal Noise. I'm actually really curious what readers will think of Fractal Noise, because I think it's my most original work. And by the way, shameless plug here. Publishers Weekly actually gave it a starred review last week.
Oh, cool.
And yeah, they called it sophisticated. So
oh, wow.
I know, bougie. I'm happy.
You made it, Christopher.
Yeah.
but to answer your question, with Fractal Noise, a lot of the aha moments happened before I started revisions, because I was not willing to start revisions without a good game plan of what to fix. And then my editor at Tor, Will, really helped me then take that new version and say, okay, you've put all the pieces in, let's take it to that next level of really paying attention to what those changes mean and how they would actually incorporate with the characters. And he actually, through his thinking, my editor's thinking, he fixed something that had been bugging me from the very start. I knew something was missing, and I didn't know what it was, and he managed to put his finger on it, and I was like, that's it. I'm going to go put it in right now. And then for Murtag, it was a similar thing, because I had a real deadline on that. I had a good outline. I went and wrote it, and then my editor went and looked at it, and she said, okay, you said the book was about one thing. It's actually about something else. And I looked at the book and I went, darn it, crap, you're right. And then that provided the guideline for then the next draft.
I'm curious, to obviously Inheritance Cycle is very popular. To Sleep in a Sea of Stars is a book talk darling. If you didn't know, people very much enjoy that book.
Oh, and, no, I didn't know that.
It's got great reviews. I'm curious, you're writing these sequels or prequels or extensions, I should say, of these well-regarded works. Does audience perception play any part, like even subconsciously for you? I mean, are you considering, I don't know if I should do this because I did this, and
I'm doing this just to spite them all.
Right? Yeah.
No, never to spite. I love my audience, love my readers. Yes and no. I mean, I am an inveterate performer in ham, and I make my living by writing things that people hopefully want to read. So I am much more in the pulp tradition of writing than I am in, let's say, the high literary tradition. So I'm a storyteller. That's how I would define myself. I have stories that I want to tell that mean a lot to me and hopefully will entertain and hopefully touch people. But with that comes the caveat that it has to mean something to me. I have to personally care about it. And the stories that I've written that I have not actually released, that have not been successful, which have been some screenplays, some short stories, some other stuff, you have all been where I haven't had a clear idea of what that fundamental story was that I was trying to convey. And actually, a great example of this in other media would be the new the modern Star Wars trilogy.
Yeah.
If you compare it with the original trilogy, if you ask someone to articulate what is Luke Skywalker's story, you know it instinctually. You can talk about it. It's very clear what type of story even is his journey. You can't do that with Rey, because it goes all over the place, and that's sort of that's a demonstration of the exact problem I'm talking about. So I refuse to even put one word on paper until I can tell someone, or have the ability to tell someone, what kind of story is this? What is it seeking to achieve for the main character? Where do we start and where do we end up? And I know some people start writing books without knowing the ending, and they discover it along the way. I just can't do that, because to me, everything that's happening has to serve where we're going.
It's funny, those new Star Wars movies, I just rewatched them since I'd seen them in theaters for the first time. And it's interesting. I feel like it started a certain way, and then I kind of hated the second one, or I guess the eighth movie. But I kind of ended up liking it the most, like the Rian Johnson one, more than the J.J. Abrams one, because I felt like it was at least trying to say something.
But see, the problem with it, sure. And I know why you're saying that, and I it's like I agree with you in theory, but in practice, I think what ends up happening is because it was such a divergence and the other people in the team, including J.J. Abrams, didn't agree with that divergence.
Yeah.
What ends up happening with J.J. Abrams' version is that first chunk of that last film, I want to say it was like the first 15 minutes, but I don't know exactly how long it was because it's been a while since I watched the film. It's actually the second film compressed into 15 minutes. It's the second film that J.J. Abrams would have made.
Like retconning stuff.
Yeah, compressed into that. And it's, if you look at the editing, it's edited in a way that no other Star Wars film is edited. Because every other Star Wars film is edited in a very classic way. I mean, even going to those wipes, the Buck Rogers wipes, right?
What I immediately thought of.
The PowerPoint wipes.
Yeah, they're not doing smash cuts. They're not doing jumpy stuff. And actually, there's something else with Rogue One, but that's a different conversation. So, so the editing is too compressed in the beginning of that last film because they're trying to retcon. They're trying to basically outline what the second film would have been otherwise, and that just is not a good way to storytell.
I think that's a really good observation, and kind of like really puts a finger on why those movies are just kind of rough. It's just what you said. I mean, it's hard to say like what they're about.
And it's hard to say.
Why should I even care?
I don't know what was going on behind the scenes. It is easy to criticize. It is hard to create, but it really is kind of stunning that with a franchise that big that, you wouldn't have an overall plan that everyone was on board with and agreed that, yes, this is going to work before you start.
I mean, it kind of like digs into my other, that question that I'd asked before is like how much of the fans, it's like I feel like a lot of those movies were such fan service and like trying to stay true to what they thought Star Wars was. And it's like, I feel like they kind of stumbled along the way, not knowing how much of that to include and how much to make a movie out of. You know what I mean? I don't know. It's weird.
Well, if it were really about fan service, we would have gotten at least one scene with Leia, Han, and Chewie all together again, and Luke.
Yeah, right. But hey, at least we got that awesome milking scene, so that was great. All right,
no
so
comment.
Back to you here. I think you did something really intelligent that I've never seen before that I loved a lot. I don't know if there's going to be a question embedded in this. We're gonna see where it goes. But on your website, fractalverse.net, there is a interactive murder mystery. It's a little novella called Unity, I believe. Is that what it's called? Yeah. And I think the barrier of entry for a lot of sci-fi novels is like new words, right? It's just people don't, like you mentioned, the tachyon beam, all these things. And it's like, it can be kind of intimidating for people to get into your world, knowing the effort that it's going to require to even understand, to be ready to understand your story. And by serving that interactive murder mystery, which is just a really cool way of like working my way through a story and kind of being a part of the creation process, so to speak. There's links to every word or term that's specific to that world that you can click on and kind of learn about your universe a little bit. So it's very clear to me that you really fleshed everything out before you started and have, as a result, you kind of have all these like side rooms of knowledge and info that you were able to kind of give us in the Unity. Tell me about Unity. When did I know nothing about the creation process. Was that just like a fun idea you had, or tell me about it?
It's actually something I've had for years of doing like a hyperlinked story, since that's how we consume a lot of text online these days, like like Wikipedia. I actually think that I know other people have done this and done a lot more with it, but I still have an idea in my head of doing a really interactive story that way that there could be a lot of fun there. But after I finished To Sleep, I wanted to do something more in the Fractalverse that wasn't going to take years to do and was going to be additional content for our website. So that's where Unity came from. And in fact, my team and I are working on a print version, which should be coming out fairly soon in the next 2 months or so, depending on how long it takes to get a couple of legal things like ISBN and stuff like that. And also, with the release of To Sleep, I commissioned a huge whackload of concept art for the Fractalverse. I worked with a bunch of top Hollywood concept artists. I mean, these are folks who've worked on Star Wars and Marvel and all sorts of other stuff. And funnily enough, they'd all read Aragon, which was cool. So I commissioned all this stuff from them, and we used that to really help build out the world and that's part of why we're doing a print version of Unity, because I think a lot of people actually haven't been to the website. So just having it up on Amazon is going to allow people to, order this full color art book and see some of this awesome stuff.
Yeah, it's beautiful. I mean, just the cover of Fractal Noise is off the charts. I love it so much. It's so good.
Well, it's funny you have to mention that.
I didn't want to mention it because I didn't want it to be this whole thing. But if you're comfortable talking about it, then
well, I mean, I said this on Twitter somewhere. I don't think a lot of people noticed, but well, we should provide some context for those listening who perhaps don't know. It turns out that the cover art for Fractal Noise is partially AI art. So the way this happened is that Tor's art department presented me with a whole range of cover concepts. And the way this works at modern publishers is if it's not going to be like a hand-painted cover, which often it is, and people shouldn't think that publishers have completely gotten rid of artists, because they haven't. You can look at any of Sanderson's covers and lots of fantasy. Tor commissions a lot of art from a lot of artists. But especially in science fiction, going with something that looks a little more modern is usually the way they like to do it. So as with To Sleep in A Sea of Stars, they pull together stock images, and their designers manipulate the stock images with, effects and text and, overlays and silvery foil, silver foil and all sorts of stuff to make it look like a cool cover. So they presented me with a whole bunch of options for Fractal Noise, just like they did for To Sleep. And I looked through all of them, and they were all pretty cool, but there was one that popped out, and I said, that looks cool. And they said, awesome. And we went around with a couple of versions with that, and then came up with what you currently see as the cover of Fractal Noise. And it was only once it got released that some very astute people out on the internet said, this kind of looks like the art you'd see on Midjourney. And Midjourney is one of the big AI, right. One of the big AI art programs out there. Now, I've played around with Midjourney a little bit, and so at first my reaction was, well, no, this isn't AI. I know this was from the designers at Tor. But then the more I thought about it, I was like, I know why they're saying that. It kind of has that look. And we did quite a bit of, the designers at Tor did quite a bit of work on the art itself. It's not the stock image, just bare bones that was originally licensed. So I went back to Tor, and they did some looking into it, and it did turn out to be a piece of AI art that formed the basis of the cover. And some people have said, well, using stock images means that an artist is not being paid, and that's actually not the case. What happens is someone creates the image. It's an artist, a photographer, whomever, and they upload the image to the stock site. And so whenever someone licenses the image, the creator of that image does get paid. Now, of course, in this case, the creator was just someone who typed some words into Midjourney. But if it had been an actual artist, that's how someone would have been paid. Unfortunately, by the time all this came out, we were already so late into the production process with Fractal Noise that there really was not time to commission an artist to actually hand paint or create a cover, which is a long and involved process. I mean, could something have been rushed? Maybe, but I mean, I don't think a lot of people outside the industry realize how rough production times are right now with the delays in shipping and everything. So for example, the illustrated edition of Aragon, the 20th anniversary, which is coming out November 7th, is going to the printers beginning of next week.
Wow.
Because they need that much lead time to actually get it printed and in stores for November.
Jeez.
Wow. So that was kind of the situation we were in with Fractal Noise. It was a no-win situation. But I have announced this, I mentioned this on Twitter, and I can say here, Tor is going to be replacing the cover of Fractal Noise on the paperback edition. So, if that's a stumbling block for someone who wants to buy the book and doesn't want to buy a piece of AI art, there will be a replacement. So possibly the hardcovers are going to be a bit of collector's editions. Now, personally, I do like the art because that's beautiful. What I picked for the cover out of the options that were presented to me. So I'm not going to lie and say I hate the art. I don't. I think it makes for a nice cover. But I also, as an artist myself, and as someone who's spent a huge amount of money to art from concept art, I really do understand the issues here, and it's difficult. I think that AI art is going to become these are just the AI programs are just going to become more another tool that artists use. Yes. But figuring out how that's going to work is something that's still in progress and presents a lot of issues.
So I want to hear about your life this last year, because you have been a busy man. You have all these side projects, and you have two main projects, Murtag and Fractal Noise. What was it like writing two books at the same time? Was your life absolute chaos? Tell me about it.
And a 6-month-old baby in the house.
And oh, wow.
Oh, my God.
Yeah, two kids, actually, but the baby is still not sleeping.
Oh, boy.
Sorry, what was the question? I'm too sleep deprived.
Yeah, right.
Surprised you even got here on time.
It's just been work. I had a big chunk of time where I wasn't releasing books and I wasn't able to write the way I wanted to write for various reasons, and that was extraordinarily frustrating. Especially since once I finished the Inheritance cycle, I was feeling like, top of the world. It's like, okay, now I can start getting through all these other stories I want to tell. And then things just ground to a halt. So I'm just trying to make up for lost time. I'm never going to write as fast as Sanderson, but doing my best. And it's just been nose to the grindstone. I mean, so in the last 5 years, I will have released 4 novels, not counting Unity, and then written a number of scripts, film and television scripts on top of that for various projects. So yeah, it's been busy.
So there was a period of time between Inheritance and To Sleep in a Sea of Stars. What was that process like? Were you just coming at stuff and it just wasn't feeling right? It was just a lot of personal things going on, and
well, I was certainly still trying to work.
Yeah.
2013 is when I wrote Fractal Noise, the first draft. And 2013 and a good chunk of 2014 was when I was doing research for building out the Fractalverse. And mind you, when I say I was doing research, I mean that's what I was doing every day. I was reading, learning. The big challenge was trying to come up with a faster than light system that didn't allow for time travel and hadn't been used by some other science fiction franchise.
Ooh, and narrow margin.
And didn't contradict physics as we know it, because the Fractalverse is set in our future and is supposed to be in the real world.
It was hacking at celestial mechanics, my friend.
Yeah, I mean, I never went to college. I was homeschooled.
Same.
I have a high school degree, but I'm entirely self-taught, and I really had to really up my math and physics skills. I ended up finding a guy who works on nuclear propulsion with NASA, and he and a couple other guys have come up with, I won't call it a theory of everything, but it's sort of heading in that direction. And it allows for faster than light travel, and it's not a theory that anyone else has used. So I had many, many calls with him, and he very kindly walked me through all the implications. And he even said I asked a few questions that got him thinking of some new things, so that was nice. But that formed the basis for my FTL technology and all that. So anyway, to answer your larger question, it was a lot of research, it was a lot of writing, and then once I actually started To Sleep in a Sea of Stars, I just got off on the wrong foot with it. I didn't do the preparatory work. This is what we were talking about. I didn't do the preparatory work with the story and the characters because after writing the Inheritance cycle, I won't say I got cocky, but I just sort of had this feeling like, well, I know what I'm doing. I'm good at it. I'm good at this. I can, yeah. And no, I can't wing it. And so I ended up writing this massive book that just didn't work. And I revised it a few times and the revisions didn't work. And the problem is every time you revise a book that's 250 to 300,000 words long, it just takes a massive amount of time, even if you're just doing small changes. And then end of 2017, I'd given the latest revisions to my editor and my agent, and they both said, you did really good work here, but it's still not working. So at that point, I'd been working on it full-time 2014, 15, 16, 17. I mean, so that's 4 years there.
And it wasn't working.
So then my decision was, do I walk away from it, or do I just really, really step back and try to figure out what I'm doing. And I hate giving up on projects. Maybe it would have been better if I'd written something else, but what I did was I wrote 200 pages of notes by hand inside of a week. And I ripped apart everything in the book. Characters, storyline. I mean, I basically went to first principles and said, this isn't working. What's the problem? Start from scratch. Wow. So if you've read To Sleep in a Sea of... And then I got a new plan, told it to my family. They liked it, and I went and wrote the version that we now have. That was 2018. Did 300,000 words in maybe 6 months, along with doing Forkwitch Worm. So that's the thing, is people were seeing nothing. You know, I wasn't publishing anything, and people are saying, "Are you still writing?" And I'm like, "I'm writing a lot. You're just not seeing it." Yeah. So if either of you or any of the listeners have read To Sleep in a Sea of Stars, you'll know the book is divided into sections. Everything after the first, I want to say 50 pages of section 2 is completely new. There was no travel to the different systems after section 2 in the original version. There were no nightmares. There were no, where was it? No Cordova, no Bug Hunt, no Nidus. None of that was in the book. No Sol. There was no trip back to the solar system. But it was a brutal experience. It's the worst rewriting experience I've ever had. The only positive is it taught me a lot of valuable skills, and revisions on Murtagh and Fractal Noise have been, although difficult, because it's always difficult, a cakewalk in comparison. And I have heard very nice things from my editor at Tor and Random House and my agent, basically saying that I seem to have mastered the process of revision in a way that few have, which is always gratifying.
Speaking of skills, learning things, do you have any advice for aspiring authors? Is there anything with regard to the writing process that you had to learn the hard way, maybe apart from revisions, which we just covered? But yeah, any advice for aspiring fantasy or sci-fi or any kind of author?
I mean, I could talk for an hour on that, on writing advice. I think a couple of the core things that make a big difference are, don't be afraid to make things difficult for your characters. Every scene, every storyline, you should always be looking for the reversals. You know, what is actually going to make things difficult? That's actually where a lot of like the pulp writers are useful to look at, because they'll always have a twist every chapter. It's like, and then this happens, and then this happens, and it always makes things worse for the main character. You don't have to go that far, but it's a useful technique. Writing about the things you absolutely, truly care about, like at the very your deepest obsessions and enthusiasms and concerns should be the topic of your writing. And fortunately, there are a massive amount of people in the world, so whatever it is you're interested in, I'm sure there are lots of other people who share those interests. But you need that depth of meaning in the work to stay enthusiastic about it for the amount of time it's going to take to actually finish a book. And then I would say actually finish your first draft. Write your first draft as fast as you can, because you can't fix something that doesn't exist. And then this was the hardest one for me to learn, and I've sort of been talking about it this whole conversation, which is that just because you write a bad sentence or a bad scene or a bad character or a bad chapter or a bad storyline or even a bad first draft does not make you a bad author. You can look at examples of editing that have been released by really well-respected, skilled writers who've been working 30, 40 years. And you can look at examples of editing on their work and see that they're still ripping apart their sentences and their paragraphs and their chapters. It's a normal part of the process. And if you're a new writer, it's going to be even more a part of the process. No one expects to sit down at the piano with no experience and play beautifully. It just doesn't happen. So once I wrap my brain around the fact that just because I wrote something that didn't work doesn't make me a bad writer, as long as I can go fix it. Right. That was a big relief, because then it takes the burden off you of trying to be perfect. And then it's almost like a superpower. You realize that you're immune to failure because, failing's part of the process and means things it means that things are happening normally. And it's normal to fail and write things that don't work, and it's normal to go fix them. And you need a why you need a reason to write that is enough to overcome the discomfort of writing. Whether that's your passion for the story, your need to put food on the table, whatever. You need a why. And it could be anything as long as it's strong enough.
That's why Neil Gaiman, I've watched an interview with Neil Gaiman, and they said, like, what drives you? And he's just like, I need to feed my family. I was broke. This is the only thing I felt like I was any good at. So this is what, and I don't like waking up early. So
yeah, hey, I definitely can relate to that.
All right. Well, as we begin to kind of draw to a conclusion here, we are in a really cool phase of fantasy literature it's fresh, and new ideas are being introduced in ways that I just feel like haven't been at any time before. And I want to pick your brain. What would you personally like to see more of in the fantasy genre? Like, what doesn't exist enough?
Books by Christopher Paolini. I say that not because I want to read my own books, but because there's too many stories I want to tell and not enough time, and I'd love a magic wand I could wave that would let me get those out faster. Boy, I don't know. That's a tough one, because a lot of times you don't know what you want until someone creates something new and you get to see it. I have a contradictory answer. On one hand, I'd love to see more stories that are just straight up fun, especially after a long day of tough news and this, that, and the other. It's nice to sit down to something that is escapism in the best sense. Doesn't mean that it can't deal with deep topics and all of that, but something that's ultimately positive and encouraging, and the hero wins in the end. I do like those types of stories. The other part of my answer, and this is the contradictory bit, is I found that after I got out of adolescence, I was less interested in reading a lot of fantasy, because so much of fantasy is geared around the coming of age story, the adolescence story. And if you're no longer in that stage of life, it can still be a lot of fun to read about that, as evidenced by lots of adults who read my books or Harry Potter, what have you. And in a sense, it's an experience we all have shared or will share or are sharing. It's one of the few universal things for humans, whereas once you're in adulthood, we all go and do different things and have very different lives. But I guess that's the thing, is once you're into adulthood, there are fewer stories in fantasy that kind of deal with adulthood and what's it like. Where's the story about the mother or the father who has kids in an epic fantasy story? There are some. And of course, I know I've mentioned Sanderson a few times. He has lots of characters who are, adults and have families and all of that. But I don't know, it just feels like there should be more types of story to deal with the different phases of life.
Yeah, that's one of the things I really liked. I don't know if you've read this trilogy, but the Broken Earth trilogy by N.K. Jemisin is a mom. And it's so nice. And I thought that a little while ago, actually, when I was reading that. It'd be cool to see more kind of like There and Back Again type, go get the MacGuffin, whatever story, but with like a parent with a kid in tow. I think that's why the new God of War remake from 2018 was so massively popular, is because this is a story about a parent. We haven't seen that very often, or it's usually about a kid turning into a parent.
And it's interesting because we see a lot of stories, a lot of movies about the dangerous lone wolf character sort of thing. And then, of course, every once in a while you get something like Taken, right? As an example, the father or the mother who has to do something. But especially after being a parent myself, boy, I'll tell you, I think a lot of those stories are written by people perhaps without children, because once you have children and once you really know what that's like, a parent is the last person I would ever mess with.
Yeah.
Because the thing is, other people might hesitate. They might have doubts. They might have, someone's child is threatened. You are getting put down. There is no hesitation on the part of the parent. They are going to take you out, whatever that takes to protect their child. It's just,
he says this with a sword over his left shoulder.
Seriously, this is a giant red sword.
And I'm ready to do it right now.
Yeah, I love that answer. Yeah, that's
a really good
cool
answer.
Yeah.
The most dangerous people are perhaps people who are violent for whatever reason, perhaps for whatever reason. But the most dangerous people in some ways are actually going to be the kindest and most protective people. And that's an interesting storyline to mine.
I mean, what is the quote of your book is, "'Tis a fearful thing to love what death can touch," right?
Well, there you go. That's Fractal Noise. That's right.
Right there.
I did
not love it.
I did not write that. That's a quote from a funeral poem.
Oh, okay.
I noticed in the Inheritance Cycle, one of the big things that I took out of it, at least, was, like, at what point are people with good intentions doing harm, in comparison to the people that they think have bad intentions doing an equal amount of harm. Yeah. Like, that's a huge part of that series it tackles, and I thought it tackled it really well. And I think that, you can kind of tie that to what you would like to see even more of in fantasy as well. It's just like,
and it's not black and white either.
Right.
I mean, for the point of view of a poor footman on the opposing side facing off with Aragon or some of the other characters, it'd be like facing a demigod. I mean, it'd be absolutely terrifying. Right. I don't know if you remember the old I say old, but it's not that old. The martial arts film Hero.
Yeah, that's a really good movie.
It's a really good film. I actually saw they slightly edited it for the U.S. market. I actually saw the original Chinese cut, which is slightly different. But I remember in the film, there was a scene where Jet Li, the main character, storms a castle, fights his way into the castle, and he's just, cutting down soldier after soldier. And of course, no ordinary man can stand against him. And I was thinking, those guys, that was just an ordinary day at work for them. And here they are being cannon fodder. And that's thoughts like that are also part of why a big part of the Inheritance Cycle was thinking about the problems with magicians. What do you do when some people actually do have abilities that are beyond what the normal human could do? How do you constrain that? How do you deal with that? It's a major, major problem.
Well, not to mention your main antagonist, Galbatorix, is very aware of that issue. And him being aware of it, it seems almost like a good intention because of the context around that system. It's so complicated.
Well, I mean, it actually goes to one of my pet peeves, and I know why writers do this. I totally understand it. But I hate when there's a story that has something unusual happen, and it never really deals with the questions about that unusual thing. Like, for example, I forget the name of the film, but there's a film with Ava Gardner, old film from the 50s or 60s, where maybe it was the title of a mannequin. I can't remember. But she's like the daughter of Zeus or something. And like the mannequin turns into her, and she's with this guy in the modern day and all of that. And it's like, okay, it's a perfectly charming film. The actors are great, but my brain immediately is going, why is not the main character immediately saying, excuse me, you're saying the Greek gods are real? And what if he's a Christian and has a different point of view, or he's, a different religion entirely? I mean, it raises so many bigger questions. Like, okay, yes, you're beautiful and all, and you want to spend time with, fine. But Zeus is real? Can we talk about this?
Not addressed.
Yeah.
Like Harry Potter, he's like, I hate when Christians?
Yeah, I hate when stuff like that gets ignored.
Yeah, it's funny though when you're creating out of basically nothing almost, it seems, or it feels like it's almost like you can never quite cover everything. You can never quite cover every question. There will always be stones left unturned. But I think you did a phenomenal job with Inheritance and overturning those stones when you could. Everybody that's listening right now, make sure to go get Fractal Noise when it comes out on May 16th. Yeah.
Or you can pre-order it. Pre-order it now.
That's even better. Pre-order it right now. Go read To Sleep in a Sea of Stars. Look out for Murtagh on November 7th, which to the delight of millions of people on the internet is coming out this year. A nice surprise for all of us.
Where do you want people to go to find you online, Mr. Paolini?
My main website is paolini.net. If you're looking for the sci-fi side of things, it's fractalverse.net. And of course, I'm highly active on Twitter and Instagram, and I even have a TikTok these days. So you can just look at my name on any of those sites.
And we'll be sure to link all of that stuff in the description on this episode. Everybody, thank you so much for listening to our wonderful conversation with Christopher Paolini. Christopher, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on Book Reviews Kill today.
I've really enjoyed it. Thanks for having me.
Everybody, hope you have an awesome rest of your day. And of course, happy reading.
Bye, everybody.